Welcome in everybody to another digital lesson where today we are going to be looking at various Civil War leaders, and we're going to start with this man right here, Jefferson Davis. Jeff Davis is a figure out of Mississippi, and he originally served as the Secretary of War for the U.S. government from 1853 to 1857. After his time as Secretary of War, he serves as a senator in the U.S. Congress from Mississippi. So he's a senator from Mississippi serving in the U.S. Congress. He served as Secretary of War. This guy has a lot of background in government. And because of his background, because he served as Secretary of War, because he had served in the U.S. Congress, the southern states elected him as the president of the Confederate States of America, the new nation that they're trying to create. They decide that Jefferson Davis, is the guy to lead them to victory. So Jefferson Davis is appointed as the president of the Confederate States of America. The next person we'll look at is Thomas Stonewall Jackson, one of the most famous commanders in the Civil War, and he was a Confederate general from Virginia. And his biggest impact is in the early days of the war. During his Shenandoah Valley campaign, he was able to tie up 52,000 federal troops with just 15,000 rebels, and his presence really distracted the Union from being able to take advantage of their goals and what they were trying to do by capturing Richmond early in the war. The reason his biggest impact happens early in the war is because he died from wounds received in battle. Following the Battle of Chancellorsville, he had been shot in the arm, ironically enough, by his own troops. So he receives friendly fire, he's shot in his arm, and he has to have his arm amputated. Following his amputation, pneumonia set in, and he died a few days later. So Stonewall Jackson is a very important general for the Confederacy early in the war, but he dies from wounds received in battle. The final Confederate leader we're going to look at is arguably the most important one, and that's Robert E. Lee. But if you look at this slide, it says, he's with the North, and that's because a young Robert E. Lee served for the United States Army. On April 15th, 1861, he was offered command of all U.S. forces. So President Lincoln recognizes that Robert E. Lee is really, really good, and he's offered command of all Union forces. He doesn't agree with secession, though, and he doesn't believe that the Union should be held together by force. So the southern states shouldn't be forced to be part of the United States if they don't want to be there. So on April 20th, 1861, he resigns his position in the U.S. Army. So he leaves the U.S. Army. And then he goes to Richmond, and he is given command of the Army of Northern Virginia. So Lee trades in his United States uniform for a Confederate uniform. And in his words, he said, quote, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." Lee did not want to fight against his family. He didn't want to fight against his kids, and therefore he had to fight on behalf of the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee is the leader of the Army of Northern Virginia. He was offered command of both the United States and the Confederates Army. He chose not to fight against Virginia, and he opposed secession, but he didn't believe that the country should be held together by force. And finally, and arguably most importantly, when the war ends, instead of encouraging the Confederates to keep fighting and to keep the war going, he says, "Look, lay down your arms. We're all Americans. The war is over. The fighting has to stop." And so Lee helps bring the country back together. Looking at the Union side, this man, arguably the most important president we've had. You could make the argument for a few others, but a lot of scholars will say Lincoln is the top president we've had. And here he is with Isabella Sojourner Truth. And Lincoln's view on slavery is that he didn't want it to spread. So Lincoln was president of the United States, and he opposed the spread of slavery. He didn't come out and say, we're going to get rid of slavery. in all of the states. That wasn't his goal at the very start. He just didn't want slavery expanding in the territories. However, in 1862, he has this idea of the Emancipation Proclamation, and you can see him shown here reading it to the cabinet. And the Emancipation Proclamation says that all slaves in areas that are still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863 will become free. So in the areas that are still rebelling against the United States in January of 1863, all their slaves are going to be freed. So Lincoln was trying to use the slaves to hurt the southern states' economies and to disrupt the way that they were able to conduct the war, because if you don't have the slave labor, you're not going to be getting things done. And Lincoln thinks that this is going to help win the war faster. So he proposes this idea that we're going to free the slaves in the South to help us win the war. So he issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which again frees any slaves in any area that are still in rebellion against the United States on January 1st, 1863. So Lincoln has a lot of important quotes, and this is one of them from June 16th, 1858. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. So Lincoln, in June of 1858, before he becomes president, believes that something's going to happen and we're not going to be divided anymore. And he believed that the United States was one nation, not a collection of independent states. So in Lincoln's eyes, we're not a collection of states. We are one country. Once the states joined the Union, that's it. They became part of one country. During his inauguration, March 4th, 1861, when he becomes president, he says, quote, I therefore consider that in view of the Constitution and the laws, the Union is unbroken, and to the extent of my ability I shall take care, as the Constitution itself expressly enjoins upon me, that the laws of the Union be faithfully executed in all the states. He says this on March 4th, 1861. By this time, several states had left the Union, and Lincoln, as president, is saying, I'm going to enforce the laws in every state. So Lincoln, even though states have allegedly left, Lincoln's saying, no, you haven't. I'm going to enforce the laws in those states. So Lincoln was determined to preserve the Union by force if necessary, and it did come to that. And then here you have Lincoln, an image of Lincoln addressing the crowd at Gettysburg. And these folks were there to commemorate a battle that had taken place there. And the battle at Gettysburg is the deadliest battle in American history. More Americans died at Gettysburg than any other battle. And at Gettysburg, he issues his famous Gettysburg Address. And here's a snippet from it. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So Lincoln writes the Gettysburg Address and says that the Civil War is done to preserve a government of the people, by the people, for the people. Incredibly powerful words, honoring the dead, saying that they didn't die in vain, and that they died to preserve something much bigger than them. Next, we'll move on to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant is the leader that Lincoln trusts to lead the Union forces in battle. But Lincoln doesn't get to Grant right away. Grant starts off as a colonel in the war. But by July of 1861, he's promoted to a brigadier general. So he goes up the ranks fairly quickly. on January 29th, 1863, he is given command of all Union forces. And then he defeats Lee ultimately in 1865 and ends the war. So Ulysses S. Grant, his nickname by the troops was Unconditional Surrender Grant because that's what he wanted, and that's generally speaking all he got. He won a lot of battles, and he ultimately defeats Robert E. Lee, and they sign a peace agreement at Appomattox Courthouse, and we'll get to that. So Ulysses S. Grant is the general who leads the Union to victory. And the final Union leader we'll take a look at today is Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass is the most famous African American at the start of the Civil War. He was a former slave, and he'd risen to prominence through his newspaper, the North Star. And he wants Lincoln to make the war about more than just states' rights. And he encourages Lincoln to emancipate or free all the slaves. And so, with his encouragement, Lincoln does emancipate the slaves in the South. And once emancipated, Douglass encourages African Americans to fight for the Union Army. So African Americans start forming regiments, and Douglass is responsible for 2 regiments, forming in Massachusetts, and they go and fight on behalf of the United States of America. And 2 of his sons end up going to fight in the war as well as part of those African American units. So Frederick Douglass is a former slave who encourages African Americans to get involved in the Civil War. Folks, we'll see you again next time where we examine the battles and events in the Civil War.